I'll stir some conversation up a little bit. So, for example, like what makes, say, the Bible or the Torah kind of the sole foundational belief that it's the only thing that could create an ethical person based on a belief system? When there are certain things like in the Bible, for example, like if you look at Deuteronomy chapter 13, where it talks about you shall have no pity to spare someone, you should actually kill that person. That's going beyond moral belief to something so far that religion promotes.
There's about 3 commandments that people use or keep in their back pocket, especially people who are not religious, to in some way throw away the whole system. I think that what we owe to the Torah is tribute, that it was ultimately this book that has civilized the world. I've never said that I believe the Torah is perfect and that I can justify every commandment in the Torah, but I'll tell you what, I could justify around 98% of them. And at the time that this book arose, around prehistoric man, primitive man, it's been the only book to have civilized the world. Now, the big question is, could we have the same outcome with Aristotle's ethics? But the thing is, life's too short to ask such a question. Now, try to duplicate the efforts or the successes that the Torah has had in bringing this world to some elevated state with Aristotle's ethics, and then I'll consider it, right? But to, in some way, throw away the whole system and try to reinvent the wheel ethically just because perhaps we could come out with a similar book like the Bible, like if you have enough monkeys in a room just typing away. I understand what you're saying. I've always said I'm not married to Torah. I would join any movement that will make me a better person. But till now, that's
so. Then, with that thought process, Rabbi, is then the Torah fallible in its word?
Not if you want to continue calling yourself a Jew or remaining in the Jewish religion. In other words, faith has a big part to play in what we believe. In other words, God first has to make himself lovable in the Torah. He has to prove himself to us. And this is why early in the Torah, we have the whole story of Sinai, and he wants all his believers to put themselves in the places where these former slaves were. And God was bringing us out just like he brought them out. However, after he proves himself as lovable, he shows us that love can't exist without standards. And he gives us this elevated law code that, at least for that time, was head and shoulders above anything else that existed, because Aristotle didn't predate the Torah. If anything, according to teachers like the Rambam, Greek philosophy was ultimately Jewish. I think most historians would acknowledge that it was a composite of many different philosophies of the time. So it's not that Aristotle necessarily recreated the ethical wheel from scratch. But I'm not against your proposal that if it could actually duplicate the Torah's values and ethics and even surpass it, that what would actually be stopping us from becoming Greek philosophers? The thing is, today, that we don't have a society built off of Greek philosophy. And societies that we know that have tossed away the Bible, places like the former Soviet Union, have only really left a trail of death and carnage. So it's really a lot to risk.
I think it's interesting as well. Oops, sorry. I think it's interesting as well. Like Aristotle, he talked about murder or killing, and he said there's neither right nor wrong. So murder is in its own category as far as like it's only wrong because the community at large says it's wrong. Only society says it's wrong. Whereas Torah says murder is wrong because God says it's wrong. There's an actual pinpoint. So like when it comes to the Holocaust, was murder wrong? Was it wrong to kill a Jew? No, it wasn't, because Aristotle said it's only wrong because society tells us that it's wrong. You understand what I'm saying?
The modern day ethics doesn't really stem from Greek philosophy. Most people who claim to be ethical nowadays and irreligious typically have great-great-grandparents who themselves were religious. So it's easy for us to discuss ethics if we're basically in the same country. You're perhaps a few hundred miles from where I am. In other words, we're not discussing this from some island in the Pacific of not knowing anything of biblical values or even Greek ethics. In other words, so we're standing on the shoulders of giants to some extent. But the thing is, I'm not willing to, in some way, throw the baby out with the bathwater just because there's things in Torah that I happen not to understand. Because the Torah was partially given to a specific people at a specific time. Now, I believe in faith that it's not just true for those men, but true for all men. But I'm not going to in any confidently way say that I could justify every command in Torah.
The problem that I have with philosophy, using philosophy to make like a moral world, is because I think the belief in God, all of the laws really in the Torah hinge on the belief in God. The belief in God for me is like an internal policeman,
Right.
right? It polices you internally. You can go into a neighborhood and you could flood it with, like a bad neighborhood, tons of cops, tons of laws. That's not going to fix anything.
Right.
But what would fix it is if most people had an internal clock. You really wouldn't need as many policemen, because that belief in God that's inside of you, it doesn't work all the time. And I'll be the first one to say it doesn't always work for me. But there have been many times where I stopped doing something, even when people weren't looking, just because of my belief in God.
But I guess my question is that a belief is kind of like a lever that once you pull it, it moves everything thereof in a person's life. The mere words of like the concept of belief come into reality once you believe them. Once believed, they become part of like your very apparatus of your mind. And determining the desires and fears and all this comes with it. In religion, the belief it does predicate certain immoral acts, like in Deuteronomy 13. And how could something like that be very ethical when you take a human life? Just to take, for example, if we were to take religion away from society, what would the Palestinian and the Jews be be fighting for? What would people actually argue for?
Give an example. Wait, give the example, because I don't have it in front of me of what you're referring to.
It says, if your brother, the son of your father, or of your mother, or your son of your daughter, or the spouse whom you embrace, or your most intimate friend tries to secretly seduce you, saying, let us go and serve other gods, unknown to you or your ancestors before you, gods of the people surrounding you, whether near you or far away, anywhere throughout the world, you must not consent, you must not listen to him, you must show him no pity, you must not spare him or conceal his guilt. No, you must kill him. It's promoting a sense of an immoral act. Your hand must strike the first blow, putting him to death, and the hands of the rest of the people following, and you must stone him to death.
You made that statement that is promoting an immoral act, like if it was in the text. First of all, so this is first making this command to a people who knew that serving idols would have the death penalty attached to it. In other words, encouraging a form of mutiny on a nation that's just being formed, and clearly laws like this had to be implemented for those who were trying to sabotage the whole system. These people, it would behoove them to leave the people of Israel instead of insisting on being there and sabotaging the whole system. I don't know why this is any more immoral than shooting deserters on a battlefield.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. I see where you're coming from.
Also, in Jewish law, people aren't allowed to just kill someone because they want to. At least the way the oral law understands is that these people are taken to a judge. Just because if you kill someone unjustly, you'll be put to death. And the court is the one who actually does the killing. But I understand that they're in some way sabotaging the uprising of a potential nation here by getting them to act in a way that God would later demand their life and the lives of their families for behaving in such a manner. Trust me, there's other verses in the Torah that bother me. Okay, this isn't really one of them. But again, I'm sure that you agree with the vast majority of ethical precepts in the Torah, more than you would agree with a Greek history book and how they behaved. In other words, a public toilet in ancient Greece was basically a bus bench with a hole in it. I'm pretty sure there's things that would disgust you even more with ancient Greek society. Not to mention that they did kill.
They used to molest children, right? Wasn't there like poems
for sure
about
women were for procreation and young boys were for pleasure?